Hello everyone, my name is Sean Cohen, my pronouns are they, them. I'm Head of Inclusive Heritage for Historic England. I'm just going to do very super quick introductions, and just a reminder that all bios are on the online bio thingy, and reminder to save all your questions to the end. So we're going to kick off with Jaime Starr. Jaime is a queer, trans, deaf and disabled oral historian that's focused on 20th century LGBTQ IA plus activist histories and hidden queer histories in historic houses. Over to you, Jaime.
So thank you for having me here. I just to give this talk because it's based off research from my GCSE Masters, which was around gaps in interpretation within queer heritage sites that some visitors notice, and when they notice them, they feel excluded when they see those. Particularly when interpretation sanitizes or simplifies the way that we talk about representative sites or the identities of people who lived, worked, and played within them. I'm going to use two sites as case study examples. These are Shipping in Halifax, which was home of Anne Lister, and Prospect Cottage in Dunphy-Smith, which was the final home of Derek Jarman. And I'll introduce them both properly in a minute. But first, I'm going to start with a little disclaimer because I know working in museums and heritage sites, it can be a little bit tense when someone goes, actually, there's a thing that might be done differently. I also work in museums and heritage sites. I do consultancy and I work in People's History Museum in Manchester. I get it. When you go to a museum, you cannot tell people everything about every object, every person, every aspect of people's lives. But choices that are made to focus on making narratives comprehensible to visitors can unintentionally lead to erasure. Margaret Middleton's work, like Queer Possibility, where they say that heritage spaces that have queerness in them but don't full name them leave queer visitors unsatisfied, and frustratingly Googling to figure out what you already know about a space, that you know that it's super queer, you know that the person who lived there is super queer, and it just doesn't really say it the way that you know is true. Marginalised audiences notice that, we notice it as queer people. And if you're already used to being a race in a space, you kind of assume that it's on purpose, even if something has been made brief and it's been made sorry, just a moment. If it's been made succinct in order to allow visitors to access it more fully, if it's simplified, you can sort of ask why has it been simplified to choose to erase these parts of people. So the thing that I'm actually going to be talking about is messy relationship structures. I'm going to be talking about cheating, and I'm going to be talking about non-monogamy that is consensual as well. These are two separate things. And it is important that we acknowledge that they are two separate things. So I'm going to just introduce a little bit of terminology before I go any further. Yes. Okay. So when we're talking about polyamory, polyamory is not cheating. These are some terms that we use for polyamory: ethical non-monogamy, open relationships, polyfidelity, relationship anarchy. Basically, any kind of consensual relationship structure where there are more than two people involved. The consent thing is the key thing. And often this can be conflated with cheating. It isn't. And people can get a little bit worried about talking about it because there might be an assumption made that you are saying that people who are in open relationships are cheating on their partners, particularly if you're talking to an audience that isn't used to that kind of terminology. A second term that we're going to use as well, which is queer platonic partnerships. And this is a type of relationship. It can be people on the asexual spectrum, but not necessarily. Essentially, it's a queer relationship between two or more people who are committed to each other, but may not be romantically and or sexually involved with each other. And I'm going to be talking about that in relation to Derek Jarman's relationship with his partner, Collins. I'm also going to the reason that I'm talking about polyamory and I'm talking about cheating, and historic houses is that industry best practice guidelines around queer language are actually hampering the way we tell stories about queer relationship structures, I feel. So the Historic England and English Heritage Guidelines around LGBTQIA language talk about terminology coming from the last half of the 20th century. And when we talk about people from the 19th century, like Anne Lister, that can involve flattening their identities. If we can't use terminology that they use for themselves, if we can't sort of talk about them in a complex way, that also gets then applied to the way we talk about their relationship structures. And when we talk about there's specific sort of guidance around not using terminology that doesn't clearly reduce to clearly familiar understandings of LGBTQIA identities. So if we're talking about relationship structures that aren't monogamous, two people mimicking a marriage or actually a marriage, then that can be erased through these guidelines. So moving on to Anne Lister and Derek Darwin. Their homes are both expressly identified in the interpretation of them as having had queer occupants in histories. Anne Lister lived from 1791 to 1840. Derek Jarman was born a century later in 1942, died in 1994. So they might not seem immediately comparable, but I think that they are. Lister and Jarman were prolific diarists and kept meticulous records documenting their adult lives, and they were also extensively documented by their friends, family, and the press. And as such, we can examine whether their understandings of self and their values and identities conform to or contrast from the curation in their homes. And despite the difference in era, gender, sexuality, politics, and the style of the house that they kept, Jarman and Lister have some striking similarities. Both were born to upper middle class military families. Both were sent to residential schools where they engaged in their first queer romances and sex. Both were caught while at school and disgraced for having done so. Derek Jarman at the age of 9 and Lister went to the mid-teens. Both publicly queer in the public eye and explored gender nonconformity in their respective societies, with Lister sort of being known after the fact as Gentleman Jack, and that was derogatory when it was applied to them at the time. It's been sort of reclaimed by modern queer audiences, but not at the time. And Derek Jarman also sort of experimented with gender expression and with drag, winning the alternative Miss World drag as Miss Crap Suzette in 1975. Something that doesn't get talked a lot about in the houses with Lister is that their diaries document what we might now recognise as gender dysphoria, including a period of time spent in France when they were hoping to find a surgeon to conduct a form of gender-affirming genital surgery that is similar to what we've now considered a phalloplasty, a construction of a penis. At the time, that was impossible, but they really, really wanted this to happen. Lister's gender identity is something of a battleground. There was a commemorative plaque that was given to Lister at the church in York, where she married Anne Walker. And it initially used the word gender non-conforming, and this was removed when the plaque was replaced because the plaque didn't initially use the word lesbian. So it was as if you could only be a lesbian if you weren't also gender non-conforming. So this is what I'm talking about when I talk about terminology, flattening identities, and people having to be one thing, and you can't talk about the other thing if you talk about one of them. Both Jarman and Lister were heavily influenced in their adulthood by romantic mentorships with older queer people. For Jarman, this also interpreted his understanding of the home as a space of queer expression when he sporadically lived with playwright Anthony Harwood. For Lister, her romance with Sibylla MacLean, who was 7 years older than her, also compelled her to consider the composition of a queer poem and making a queer pilgrimage to Glasnevin in Llangolan, which I'm probably mispronouncing, I've never heard it said out loud, to see how sustainable a same-gender relationship with a significant age gap was. They invested a lot of time and money in their homes and gardens as queer expressions of self and their connections to Englishness, which were core pillars of their respective identities, expressed in their diaries and in their collecting. The Prospect Cottage, in keeping with Jarman's queer nonconformity, stands out drastically from the other fishermen's cottages on Dungeness Beach. It's painted black pitch, and it's situated with vivid yellow door frames and looks like hatted warning sign. Lister, by contrast, was politically conservative, and she was living at the height of the British Empire, and connects triumphantly to her Englishness, and reaches back into Gothic and Restoration era furniture and architecture, and actually built that neo-Gothic tower on the side of the building, which wasn't in keeping with the other historic homes, the other contemporary homes in the area. Both the homes have been sites for pilgrimage during or after the lives of their most famous queer residents, but it's important to say that neither home was solely home to one queer person. And Lister had three relatives, including the last Lister to live in the property, John Lister, who rediscovered the diaries that had been hidden behind a wall. And we almost lost the diaries to. He was told to burn them when it became clear that they contained queer content, because he was queer and because there was an idea, eugenics-based idea, that if you had a queer relative, that meant he was queer and he would be outed by that. Derek Jarman's house also was not solely home to him. He lived there with his partner, Keith Collins, and he had lots of queer friends and relatives, queer friends who came to visit him. So did Anne Lister. John described the house as the most public AIDS house in England, and the unwalled garden has become a site of memorial for what he called the fraternity of sickness between queer HIV-positive men. And as such, 3 HIV-positive men have had their ashes scattered in Prospectus garden. It's also borne witness to queer weddings, and John's canonization by the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, who sainted him as Saint Derek of Dungeness of the Order of Celibate Knights. There's a little religious connotation to Lister's home as well, which the Anne Lister birthday week organised with Pat Estate describes as the Lords for Lesbians. So that's who Lister and Jarman are. They have one more big thing in common. They both loved sex. And obviously, in a heritage property, one where you're going to have lots of school trips going to it, you might not want to talk a lot about sex. But they did. They loved sex and they loved talking about it. The depiction of Jarman and Lister's queerness in their house museums doesn't talk about sex. Most houses don't, except for when you talk about people having lots of children, or if you're in a palace where someone had a mistress and you can nudge and you can wink and it's heteronormative and it's safe. In their diaries, Jarman and Lister make clear that frequent casual sex is key to their sexualities and their understanding of self. Derek Jarman Starr in the AIDS quilt calls it a horrible ladies quilt that domesticates queerness, and states that if he was to have a panel more or less in it, it should contain old taxi receipts hamstered and a membership to the Subway, which was a 1970s and 80s sex on premises venue. In Lister's case, she had developed a personal lexicon of sex acts in her diaries, which has been used to vindicate the idea that same-gender relationships presumably weren't sexless, as claimed due to a lack of written records. While Lister had several long-term partners, she had reported repeated infidelities, on several occasions documenting that her voracious sexual appetites and lack of interest in fidelity had led her to have affairs with more than one of her partner Marion Balcomb's sisters in the same house. Yes, 2 minutes. 2 minutes? Okay. So this is actually what I wanted to come to, was Lister. This is a web of Lister's sexual and romantic connections. You can see how many of them are called Balcombe for a start. So Lister is often presented as the first modern lesbian, and this is done in a context where she isn't really talked about in the context of her community. The only person who's talked about with her in her house is her last romantic partner, Anne Walker. Similarly, Jarman's house, which I'm going to jump onto very fast, I can talk to people more about this later. Jarman lived with Keith Collins. They described their relationship in various ways, but both of them agree that they were not sexually compatible. Matt Cook describes them as care partners. Keith Collins describes himself as Cassamites at one point in an interview with The Independent. But Prospect Cottage is presented solely at Derek Jarman's house, even though Keith lived there longer than he did. Keith did not consider it his home, but he was there as a resident. But the house is presented as it was when Derek Jarman died, and he isn't really talked about. There's nothing there of his. And people actually point out that the only thing that he put in after Derek Jarman died was a television, which he kept hidden. So he hides himself within the house. And he's also hidden within the interpretation of the house. I'll just read, he said in this interview, we don't see it together. Derek's always been too old for me, and I've always been too old for Derek. He likes it. I go back to Newcastle to visit my boyfriend every other week, while Derek has his bits of bluff on the side. He likes to have his image pricey, but he's always popping up to Hampstead Heath. And in my role work with older queer men who lived through the 1980s, particularly HIV positive queer men, I've noticed this type of long-term queer platonic domestic partnership appears to have been entered by numerous queer men of that generation. It's not often talked about, particularly in a heritage context. So this blossoming of of queerness to the expected dynamics within a relationship.
That's very poetic.
I will just finish that.
Yeah, sorry, that wasn't supposed to happen.
So it can be quite difficult for people to perceive why you might want to be in a queer platonic relationship if you haven't experienced one yourself or you don't know anyone who's in one. So this can often be flashed into they were boyfriends and that's it. But particularly when you were living in an era when queer people were denied care, having access to a care partner, as Matt calls him, was vital to survival. People being refused access to healthcare and being refused access to care in the community. Both in relationships outside of these boundaries, but when they're presented in homes, it's emulating what John called het suck, ideals of safe and respectable relationship standards. It's very difficult to unlearn coming to queer relationships and talking about them in a way which maybe, particularly for people who lived under Section 28, we were sort of being told that we were sexually voracious, and that was a bad thing. So talking about people and acknowledging people that did have these relationship structures and that it's okay to have these relationship structures. As we come into an era where more people are openly monogamous, it's going to give people reflections of themselves. And I'll leave you with questions of how do you talk about partnerships in your work? Is it inclusive of non-monogamous relationships? Is it inclusive of relationships where sex and romance aren't part of it, but partnership is? Do you work in a house museum that's been used as a cruising site or where people have had, and you can find this out, do you work in a museum that, or a heritage house where people have had children outside of wedlock? Do you talk about that if it's heterosexual, and is there acknowledgement of partnerships where there has been non-heterosexual partnerships outside of a marriage? Why is one appropriate for a public audience and the other isn't? And how can we serve queer audiences whose families look non-normative and make them feel included in the stories that we tell as we tell them? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gary. I swear I've seen that Lister web on the L word. Next, we're hearing from the National Trust. We're hearing from Noël van Riswick and Hannah Squire. I found out the pronunciation of one name and got the other one. Noël manages programs and experiences at the National Trust for a number of properties in Kent and East Sussex, and Hannah is collections and house manager overseeing collections at Sissinghurst, Small Hythe Place, Lamp House, and Stoneacre. Over to you both.
Okay. Hello, how are you all doing? That's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for those organisers who welcome us to talk about our liberties today. So yes, my name is Noël. I am based at Sissinghurst.
Yeah, well, I'm Hannah, and we both relatively new to working at Sissinghurst, so I've been there about 7 months, and Noël's been there just over a year. So we're really kind of passionate and eager to build on kind of the legacy of the work that has been done at Sissinghurst and how we can build on it. Okay, next. Oh, there's a picture. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm sure many people now are familiar with the story of Sissinghurst, but I thought I'd just briefly kind of put it into context. So within the Natural Trust, in terms of quakery, it's a really important space. So in 1930, the writer, gardener, physical embodiment of the Virginia Woolf's Orlando came across Sissinghurst Garden, which was an Elizabethan ruin with a Victorian farmhouse. Vita and her lover Dorothy Wellesley came across it on a spring morning, and Vita was looking for a home for herself, her husband Harold Nicholson, and their two sons Ben and Michael. You can see here, either side of Vita and Virginia Woolf. They had the tower background sitting out. Sissinghurst has a space with a real inspiration for Vita and Harold. So with Vita, we have, you can see the tower behind it as its incredible queer space. We have Vita's writing room, which is kind of in aspect of how she had it there. It was a very kind of private, intimate space that very few people ever went into. It was mainly for Vita and her lovers, and occasionally for her husband Harold, who was sort of invited in occasionally. But her sons themselves describe only ever having been in this space a few times during their lifetime. We tend to focus on the story of Vita Sackville West as well, and Harold Nicholson, husband, is somebody who I'd really like to explore more. So Harold Nicholson was a writer, a diplomat, a gardener as well, and they both had a relationship outside of their marriage. As well as Vita's writing in the tower, we have Harold Nicholson's study there. And the third queer space, actually, which has been sort of, I think, overlooked in the past, we want to bring out, is their son Nigel's writing room gazebo, in which he wrote and published Portraits of a Marriage, which was kind of a real seminal text in the 1970s, which happened because Nigel discovered in Vita's writing room, after her death, was going through it, discovered this kind of nondescript Gladstone medical bag with his mother's initials on, couldn't find a key into it, took a knife to open it and found this manuscript which described his mother's relationship with Violet Trefusis. So it was one of her first loves, a really important relationship. He discovered this. And I think sometimes as children, we don't think about parents as having their own identity or their own kind of relationships outside of ourselves. And then he wrote this Portrait of a Marriage, kind of using both of Vita's reminiscences of her relationship with Violet within the context of her and Harold's marriage. And listening actually to Jaime talk about polyamory within relationships, Sissinghurst is a really important space, I think, to explore this, because as it was in ruins that Harold and Vita bought, there's lots of separate spaces within the garden that you explore. So it's kind of almost compartmentalized their lives. So we have Harold's studied in one section, Vita's in another, their children's bedrooms are in another, all within the context of this internationally world-renowned garden.
Yes, and despite us having such a rich queer history, we still find that our history sometimes is erased. So I wanted to show you a quick clip from 2008, where you can see one of my colleagues from then and one of the family members, Tita's grandchild, describing one of the displays that was taking place in 2008.
Researching his book has reminded Adam that the exhibition at Sissinghurst is overlooking a key element.
You know, the gay thing is just so important in the way, you know, in the foundation of Sissinghurst, or modern Sissinghurst anyway.
He's decided to raise the subject with Visitor Services Manager Sam Butler.
And yet we never say a single thing about it.
But do we need to say anything about it? Because people seem to already know about it and accept it.
Right. So, yes, I mean, I've said this already. Yes, sometimes it's our history seems to be erased. And what we did, and thanks to our predecessor, Eleanor Blanco, basically started a collections team at Sissinghurst. We started off with really challenging the status quo at Sissinghurst and really seeing what we could do better and interpreting our collections. So I started speaking with our volunteers and I asked them, why do you think that we aren't discussing this history with our visitors? And they really felt like discussing queer histories, particularly with families, wasn't appropriate. They said, well, you know, we can't really talk about affairs or gay sex with visitors, and therefore we shouldn't try in the first place. To just refer back to one of my colleagues, Eleanor, she tried to make some efforts in that area, and she really sort of decided that actually we should make an effort. And she then decided to include queer histories in every exhibition that we did, but never really overtly. So following my discussions with the volunteers, we realized we really should do a little bit more, and it should be more overt, more obvious, and really developing a queer history with a stronger emphasis on queer history. So what we also did was expand volunteer sub-forums and celebrate Pride. What I tried to do during those volunteer forums is really suggest to our volunteers, actually, families nowadays are aware of queer relationships. It's not something you should shy away from. Most children nowadays, they have a close link with gay parents, or their parents have had divorce. So they are aware of complex relationships, and therefore it is something that can be discussed and should be discussed.
Yeah, I'm also very much aware, because I myself did it as a teenager, that Sissinghurst is like a pilgrimage. I found it a space kind of really feel welcome and part of kind of queer history there. So I visited Sissinghurst, Virginia Woolf's mother's house, Charleston, looking at the kind of wider community group and Noël. And we're really looking at how we could kind of embed this when our visitors come. Because when I came when I was younger, whilst I kind of got so excited by being in the tower and feeling that presence, I felt that it wasn't really reflected in the interpretation, the stories we were telling, as well as in the way that our volunteers were telling these stories. So I can't take any credit for this, because this was all really happening before I started early this year. This was Noel's idea to look at and really explicitly in our collections exploring our queer heritage. So we are still very much known as garden at Sissinghurst, but we have over 12,000 books, a really important book collection, the most important 20th century collection of books within the trust. And within these books are some incredible inscriptions, notes, love letters, poems, and photographs of many lovers of Lisa and Harold. And this exhibition was really around not just the Radwicks, but exploring those. And so I mentioned the Gladstone bag, which is used, and you can just sort of see in the back of the tower, which really brought out in this big room space. At Sissinghurst, we are also kind of limited by the spaces people have access to, and accessibility is a big thing we need to work on, because our two historic spaces that we have open are, well, visitors right to leave in the town you can't go into unless you're kind of a researcher and you ask, beforehand to come and look in. It's closed off, you can just sort of peer in. And the other space we have, our big room, well, we've been getting around for it, because while it's on the ground floor, it's difficult to get into. But within this space, we thought the big room was the space to try and kind of explore these relationships. So both looking at Vita and Virginia as a photograph, Harold and his long-term partner, Raymond Mortimer, and also things like, for example, the Well of Loneliness, which was we looked at the trial. So people know Lady Chatterley's lover as an Irish censorship, but looking around how this earlier novel, written in the same year as Orlando, became a really big precedent for looking at a novel that explores lesbian relationships. And Vita very excitingly has newspaper articles at the time, and her reflections on the trial. She wasn't actually able to speak, she did offer to, but didn't. So it's just how we can, particularly in our book collection, explore these relationships within the space. And this exhibition started in June, celebration of Pride, and continuing on till March, if you'd like to come and visit, with varying objects changing over that.
Yes, so what we decided was to create this exhibition, which was first going to go back to book collection, and then it would later move into a different exhibition, which would then further go into celebrating Pride at Sissinghurst. We made some other changes as well, such as the QR, which you can see over there, which allows visitors to sort of really learn more about it quite quickly. At our visitor reception and other areas that were really public facing on arrival, we acknowledge that some of our front of house members of the team may feel a bit apprehensive or nervous to really delve into these subjects. So we really wanted to make sure that there was as much information as needed available for the public, while also making sure that our team felt comfortable and empowered in the space. Some other things we did as well is we had some free workshops. One with directing Orlando. We also had a workshop that sort of allowed visitors to create a sequel to Orlando the book. And yes, we did also have a Radical Relationships exhibition. We know that we're quite keen to now look at discussing Pride every February. And I'm very happy that it will now also be based in the Brighton every February.
That was a long discussion.
Yeah, but it's really surprising because you might think, well, every other institution is doing it. Somehow it still felt quite scary for us. See, we are a sort of refuge, but we are still situated in rural Kent in a way. So it comes with challenges. And with those challenges as well, we also weren't quite sure to really start in June, because June is also our busiest month as a garden. But we decided that we should start in June and really kick things off. And then any learnings we could then take on into February the year after.
So just to kind of teach you future things that are happening. So an exhibition I'm working on that's opening in February in our phase of exhibition space. We're giving that info of the right. We know she's kind of known as a gardener, but she really wanted to be remembered in the canons in literature. And I think when you're associated with a genius like Virginia Woolf, you'll see a sort of lesser, despite being a bestseller. And so I've been working with a group of staff and volunteers to create interpretation for the book club as well, a wider book club, staff volunteer community, exploring Vita's fiction and how her life aligned with that. So one of the novels looking at is Challenge, which Vita wrote is fictionalised that relationship of violence and abuses. So working with, I wanted to have a kind of wider range of voices in this exhibition. So working with them, and also with an artist called Sarah Tanit-Jones, who creates these really beautiful, vibrant visual interpretations of this fiction and poetry as well. So that will be opening up within that space. Yeah. Yes, and also me and Noël have kind of been really early stage of this brainstorming around how we can have Sissinghurst as well as an important cultural centre for our queer local community within Kent, and how we have these spaces within there, but how we can really open it up and afford for people to come and use and to work with more contemporary queer artists to really impact our collections and unpack these contemporary stories, as well as also embedding in everything we do. So we're looking at introductory videos on site. I've been working as well what we can do more on our online presence and social media for accessibility ones, particularly around Vita's writing room, how we can kind of tell those space stories and open that space up to a wider audience who might not be able to be physically access those spaces.
Yeah, just to respond to that as well in terms of opening up to wider audiences, what we wanted to do initially, for me to sort of suggest that we could go this direction as a visitor attraction, I had to justify it in terms of visitor figures. And what I sort of suggested is, yes, we would be able to attract a young metropolitan audience to Sissinghurst, and we would be able to have more repeat visits by people who would recognize Sissinghurst more as a sort of queer pilgrimage, just as their pilgrimage Prospect Cottage. But actually what we found is that a lot of our senior visitors, they had really positive feedback, and lots of members as well. They were really happy to see something like this at the National Trust. One of the most beautiful feedbacks I received was that a lesbian couple who have been members for, National Trust members for 30 years, wrote a comment card that suggested that it was the first time they felt welcome in the National Trust space, which was really lovely to read.
Yeah, and also it's just about, for example, like I've been looking at how we can do Christmas in the future, and there's some really wonderful books and presents that we give as an example by using the launch in this one of these sons to that beautiful painting of Sissinghurst. So how we can also in the future these big times of year kind of queer Christmas, and how we can look at stories like that. And I had something else to say, I forgot. Oh yes, also it's not just Vita and Marvel, it's the other people that live in our community. So we're looking at in the future exploring some of the staff that works there and Vita helping there. So there's a great story around trans chauffeur who works and lived assistant nurse, and exploring kind of those women's relationships around the land army who kind of lived there during the war. We also have one of Vita's secretary who she of course had an affair with, and kind of looking at their relationship too. So also the wider queer community at Sissinghurst, so they can not just focus around Vita and Hunt.
Great, that was all.
Final speaker for this portion is Indigo Dunphy-Smith. Indigo works for National Trust for Scotland and is co-chair. Oh, I thought you were correcting me. For Scotland, and is co-chair of their LGBTQ network. Great question. Chat away.
Yeah.
Which button is it? Everybody do it.
So forward,
Back. Great. Can I put this on the stand? Because I
Sure.
have three.
God, I don't know why I'm pretending I'm doing anything here.
Yes. Right. I need to kind of put my notes and plan for the clicker.
Do you want me to? You can just ask me and I'll move the slides on if you'd rather.
They're out of order. So it's a whole thing. It's all right. So everyone, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I know I'm a shift before lunchtime, so I will try and make it good and interesting. Maybe not keep it too long. So I'm going to be talking about a queer tour and object trail that I wrote for the Georgian House, which is a National Trust for Scotland property in Edinburgh. And I'm going to, I'm going to talk more broadly about the methodology behind it, and so you can imagine how it would be applied to historic house that you might be familiar with. And this is the little booklet here. I've brought some along with me as well, if you'd like to take one home, and just to emphasize that it's got a real DIY, grassroots nature to the project, as it was just me, the internet, and Quimper. However, in the last year, well, I'm going to hang on, come back to that. So I'll give some examples of the methodology also applied using the Georgian House, as the stories are too interesting not to tell, and I am pretty much a storyteller. And then after that, do a quick wrap up with some challenges and reflections, and just a quick content warning that some of the stories listeners might find distressing, as they include themes of discrimination and death. Well, we're moving on to this slide. So this is the Georgian House. So it's the one with the blue door. Has anyone been to the Georgian House before? Hey, a couple of people. So we're next door to the First Minister of Scotland. So you know where to find us next time you're in town. So historic properties often appear frozen in time. And my project has tried to recontextualize and broaden the interpretation around the objects and spaces in the house, making room for a wider range of stories to be reimagined. And the Georgian House is a 1790s townhouse in Charlotte Square. It's part of Edinburgh's UNESCO World Heritage listed New Town. It was first owned by the insignificant and wealthy-ish Scottish land-owning Lamont family. Anyone heard of the Lamont family? Yeah, they're not interested. So, moving on. So, good news is that my DIY guide leaflet has been given a little bit of funding recently. It's not yet being printed, it's in the pipeline for next year, but this is potentially what it might look like when it's on shiny paper. I'm going to talk a bit about the methodology applied to historic house so far, but it's good to mention here that the methodology actually doesn't rely on direct information related to the owners of the house, as the Georgian House is effectively a set, and none of the objects belong to anyone who lived in the house. And the development of this interpretation follows these main avenues you can see here. So contextual framing, creative interpretation, queer coding, and 3 degrees of separation. All right, so the objects and so queering the Georgian House. So this is the parlour. The objects and spaces within the townhouse are used to tell the story of Edinburgh at the turn of the 19th century. And my aim is for visitors to be able to learn more about the house, and in doing so, Georgian Edinburgh in a queer context. So the first method that I used to queer the house was to reorient its contextual framing, which is kind of twofold. So the immediate context of the house, so the discussion of domestic spaces as central to queer lives. So homes have always had dual functions as public and private places. They've served as places for fashioning yourself for public consumption, and or as safe spaces for private reflection and expression. And homes were and are places to retreat out or to create. And then the second part is the broader influences that shaped queer life during the period. So situating queer narratives within larger historical contexts reminds visitors that queer people were shaped by the time period they lived in, and the period shaped what queerness looked like as well. And that queer lives are part of a shared history and not separate from the main historical events that happened. So in the Georgian period, for an example, queer histories are connected to ideas around the Enlightenment, empire building, and classical revival. So, for example, in the late 18th century marks the moment when ideas around the individual began to form, and homosexuality went from an act to an identity, meaning it went from something you did to something that you were. And you can see that here in this little newspaper clipping from 1346, which is reporting on a raid in Mother Clapp's Molly House. So the clipping is from the, so you can see here it says the Molly House described as a place where sodomy is frequent rather than a place where sodomy is practiced. And the clipping is from the Caledonian Mercury, which was a newspaper published in Edinburgh while the Langs lived in the house. And it tells us that police surveillance and intervention in queer life and culture was reported on in local Edinburgh newspapers. So it's usually at this point in the tour that I'll like pick up a copy of a newspaper that we have, part of our handling collection, don't worry, and pose the question, was the raid read about in rooms just like the parlour across the city of Edinburgh? The second method is a little bit of creative interpretation. So connecting everyday objects in the house to the stories of known queer figures or histories in Edinburgh is a chance to link the house to its wider context. So some might be broad. For example, this globe in our parlour is used to tell wider stories about empire, European readings of the world, colonial contact and control, and different cultures' approaches to sexuality and gender. The other one we use is our kitchen as well. The other one we use is this little spice box here, which is in the kitchen. And we talk about the exchange of ideas via trade, such as in the merchant navy in the 18th century is where Polari developed and made its way to Scotland via docks and pubs and theatres, 40 houses, port towns in the UK. And the words are made up of Cockney rhyme and slang, Yiddish and Italian, reflecting the diversity of the people who spoke it. And for anyone who doesn't know, Polari is the code of language made up of slang words used by men seeking intimacy with other men. And there are quite a few words that visitors or you guys might be familiar with, such as nap, pan, and butch, which are all Polari words. Or you might be able to link objects to stories about a particular person. So they come in as like story markers. So we use, I think this is where to get hazy. We use our medicine chest to talk about Dr. Jaime Starr, who graduated from Edinburgh Uni with a medical degree in 1812 and worked in the British Navy throughout the Empire as a surgeon. So we kind of say on the tour, we talk a bit about medicine chest and how it works and what it is, and suggest that he may have had one just like it, or purchased something similar from the shop that it was sold on Main Street in Edinburgh that the house is close to. So here is Barry as a recent graduate, about 1813, and then the other one is a photo of Barry on the left with his companion John and their dog Psyche around 1862 in Jamaica. So there are many layers that we unpack on the tour, discussing whether James was intersex or a trans man. There was a book that was published recently saying that he was a woman trying to find freedom in a man's world. So we try and talk about all of these different ways that James could be interpreted, and also the nature of James's relationship with John, dipping into discussions about power dynamics of class, race, and sexuality. Always bringing it back to the context of Edinburgh as a centre of medicine in the 18th and early 19th century, and how various choices were shaped by access to travel around the empire. And then we'll run back this way. The third method we used to talk about is kind of cultural associations or queer coding, drawing it into a historical queer context, and point out the themes and figures that code in or communicate alternative queer meanings. So some examples of figures here that we use from the 18th century is this stippled engraving in our little bedroom. So at first I thought this engraving was an intimate encounter between Artemis and Atalanta, but it then became apparent that it was actually Diana and her huntress Castillo. However, for those of you with a keen eye in the room, the eagle with lightning in its talons at the bottom left indicates that Diana is actually Jupiter transformed to appear as Diana. And we highlight the style of the image and the cultural fashions of the time, so that a revival of classical themes and figures in the Georgian period. So much so that actually in our information in the house for a very long time, it's been incorrectly titled as Classical Scene with Sappho. That's what it is. and artist unknown as well. But a mix-up in the identification could be because by the 18th century, the classical poet Sappho's legacy had become intertwined with lesbian history, and the word sapphic was first used as a descriptor for same-sex desire between women in the Georgian period, so 1761. And it's here I might point out to visitors, we also have, also in our second edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, that we have in the house, which was written and published in Edinburgh, it refers to homosexuality in its definition of Sappho as well. And so whilst our image here is not strictly depicting a sapphic relationship, its distribution as an engraved print would have read as two women engaging in an internet exchange. And these different types of media indicate that people would have been aware of these kind of correlations and been exposed to these images. Then the next. Sorry about that. And then this is our drawing room. And we kind of use the interpretation method of 3 degrees of separation. So this approach looks for social, cultural, legal, or geographical connections to the house. So, for example, we encourage our visitors to look at the drawing room windows here across the view of Charlotte Square. And we point out this church. So Anne Lister, who we've all been introduced to, visited this church during her tour of Scotland in 1828 while in pursuit of a woman called Isabella McLean. And you can see here on the book, there they are, Anne Lister and Isabella. And you can see on the screen here some images of additional events that we organised on this topic. So me introducing a lecture and walking to a group standing outside the house that Anne Lister and Isabella McLean stayed in while they were visiting Edinburgh, which is kind of a 5-minute, if that, walk from our museum. And for both sold-out events, we collaborated with a local guide and Anne Lister in Edinburgh expert, Steph Lauer. You can see the back of her head there, she's in green. Right. And then also looking out those drawing room windows, we also point out number 22, you can just see it there in orange. And we tell the story of a woman named Lady Helen Cumming Gordon, who in 1811 was sued for defamation by 2 of her granddaughter's female teachers. So Lady Helen had withdrawn her granddaughter Jane Cumming from their school after Jane had reported she'd witnessed the 2 teachers having sex. So Lady Helen also wrote to the rest of the parents in the school, all wealthy families living in the Newtown area, advising them to also withdraw their daughters from the school and what grounds. And this actually resulted in the collapse of the school. And the school was, again, a 5-minute walk from our museum. And in the court case, several members of the community are called to the witness stand, and over a period of almost 10 years with a few appeals, the lawyers debated whether it was possible for 2 women to have sex. So some things never really changed. And you can see the original document on the screen here, which you can see in the Signet Library in Edinburgh. And it says, authorities with regard to the practice of tribadism. And it goes for pages and pages and pages of all of these different, 18th century and backwards kind of definitions of tribadism and all different languages, as the lawyers tried to compile that, yes, lesbians did have sex.
2 minutes.
Okay, cool, thanks. And then also they debated how, not if, but how 16-year-old schoolgirl Jane's illegitimacy and her Indian background influenced her claims. So this is a chance to bring in a conversation about the role that race plays in sexuality and how it was and is perceived. And although the people who lived in our property did not have any children at the school, we know that all these families socialized in the same circles. So I think it's pretty fair to speculate that conversations about the case would have taken place in the house, and maybe there was a bit of curtain twitching happening out the drawing room window while this case was unfolding when the first family lived there. Really exciting. Can't tell you too much about it because it's top secret. But there's actually potentially a film based on this story that will possibly use the house as Lady Cumming Gordon's house in the upcoming film. Has anyone seen The Children's Hour? So that is based on the story that I'm talking about as well. So if you haven't watched it, it's a good one to watch. So those are the 4 main methods for queering the house. And then we've got the usual challenges and reflections, so kind of missing evidence and this kind of straight into proven gay mentality. What is a queer story? Is queer the best word to use? And changing definitions of intimacy. So making sure these queer stories resonate with modern audiences and their understandings of queerness, privacy and identity, and a continuous reflection on what intimacy meant both in the historical period you might be researching or we were researching, I was researching, and what in audiences you are engaging with. And you're doing this work to explore or highlight in some way how those definitions of intimacy may shift when you're considering queer lives as well. So I'm going to find a little bit. So for example, I was trying to interpret this book of poetry, which was found in our Georgian House bookcase by a woman called Catherine Talbot. So on her death, Catherine left her poetry and writings to her close friend Elizabeth Carter. Both of them were early members of the Blue Stocking Circle. And the book was published after Elizabeth Carter's death by her nephew, who included additional correspondence between the two women. And he wrote in the foreword about Talbot, "Yet there is no reason to believe that she ever had any wish or intention on entering into that state of marriage, or had ever formed any such attachment as to induce her to desire it. At least this appears certainly to have been the case after her acquaintance with Miss Carter commenced." So neither women married, and there seems to be some level of acknowledgement and acceptance that their friendship was a replacement for marriage. And it's through examples like this that we can open up discussions about queerness in the past, how it was received, considered, and expressed within the walls of the Georgian townhouse. And so just to conclude on a very boring slide, the recontextualizing and reinterpreting of the house through a queer lens, there are many personal and broad stories to share with visitors. And together, against the backdrop of the house, they diversify and enrich our understanding of the property in the context of its first owners, and affirm that queer lives have always been part of our shared cultural and social heritage. And by applying the various techniques I've outlined to the objects and spaces of the house, I believe that this methodology really offers a way for then house museums to creatively queer their interpretation and overcome the barrier of intangibility, which is often associated with queer histories during earlier historical periods like the 18th century. And as we continue to explore these histories, we can begin to see historic spaces not as frozen relics, but as living, evolving places where diverse stories make not just inclusive, but tell fuller and more dynamic stories of our past. Thanks, guys. Yeah. Okay.